What assumptions do we carry that shape how we see a person? How does that impact how we interact with them? Today we're speaking with Inez Feria of NoBox Foundation about their work, how they challenge dominant narratives about people whose lives involve drugs, and how they advocate for compassion, dignity, and recognizing humanity in one another. I'm your host, Albert Orr, and this is Drawing on Hope, where we talk to inspiring people who will paint for us their vision of a better world. Before we jump into the conversation, click the like, subscribe, and follow buttons. It helps others find our show and be part of this movement for hope.
There's just so much nuance, like when you think about the nuance and the stories, and then the parang pressure, no? But just to do justice to the work. Alam mo yun, do justice to the people we're talking about. Siguro it's more that.
So maybe we can start first with how do you usually introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Inez. I'm a founder and director of NoBox Philippines. So it's essentially a nonprofit organization set up to advocate for the rights and well-being of people whose lives include drugs. So this means advocating for drug policy reform, harm reduction, and really about advocating for the well-being and rights of people whose lives include drugs, meaning people who have been alienated and marginalized. So therefore, it means trying to continually having a better understanding of the situations. So addressing, for example, what are the understanding systemic issues in relation to drug use and concerns that we typically attribute to drugs, when in fact it is the system and the context in which the things are happening. It's also evolving into understanding how mindsets and language really matter because it reflects our understanding. And again, this understanding shapes the programs and policies that we think are appropriate and needed. My background is in psychology, medical anthropology, so it really gives me that lens to try to understand how as humans, how we make decisions, and also understanding where you always hear it in advocacy, lived realities. So I think even in anthro, you understand also it's from the perspective of those living living with the realities that are the experts that we typically don't recognize or value. So siguro yun yung advocacy. So you can see medyo nag-evolve siya through the years. So it's a continuous evolvement talaga. So yeah.
Yeah. So what moved you personally to get involved in the work that you're doing right now?
I think it wasn't like a one-time thing, a one moment, but something that just kind of evolved. It's moment siguro where I saw how people using drugs are treated unfairly just for the simple reason that they're using drugs or associated with drugs. It's, for example, I remember instances where I had the opportunity to visit some facilities which are supposed to provide help and treatment, and observed how they talk down to people there who's supposed to be under their care. How, in short, they're stripped of their humanity and dignity. There was one time we were in a place where there was a group of individuals, older individuals, men, and these were the ones who were in the communities parang associated with drugs nga, no? Allegedly using and so on and so forth. And there's this young official talking to them. And yung pagsalita, alam mo yon, yung admonishing and stuff like that. Sabi ko parang, tapos nakayuko na lang sila, opo, opo, opo. That was so hard. That was so hard to see. no? Nawawala yung human to human respect and connection. So may mga ganon moments, no? That sense of unfairness, siguro. But then I think in when you say kasi get involved in this work, malawak yun, saka nag-evolve, di ba? So primarily, I was actually, sabi ko nga, I saw how people were being treated even in health facilities where they were supposed to be, it was supposed to be a place of support and care, and parang hindi, no? So I was thinking then also na, we need to set up programs that are more kind and who treat people as people, no? And who actually work with them to understand so that whatever programs, whatever we do here is relevant to their lives and actually useful. Pero nag-evolve na rin yun. So when you say in this work, in the whole idea of working in the field of drugs, that may have been a start. When we say involved in this work, we're really strongly advocating for changes in the way our policies are, the law is, how we treat each other as human beings. Then that really evolved also, and the exposure of getting to know, for example, individuals where drugs would be a part of their lives. At the same time, even before knowing that drugs is a part of their lives, like they're so brilliant, these are scholars, and then you realize, wait a minute, drugs is just part of people's lives, right? And we don't even know what the role of drugs is in their lives. And a lot of times, it's not the starring role. So doon siya nag-evolve. Na teka muna, if we want policies that truly support and protect, let's step back. No? Try to understand what the system looks like. Try to understand the context. Try to understand what's really going on. So that's when I think of the work, it's more that, right? And how do we work together and build on the resources we have to make life better for everyone, di ba? Kasi when we think of people whose lives include drugs, we're talking about people who are part of society. A lot of times, the way we talk about things, even in advocacy, parang iba siya. Di ba? We have society and there's this group of people out there. Dapat hindi eh. So, balik din sa mindset. Because then, when we are able to create spaces, when there are spaces where conversations can openly be had, then you can see also the shifts. When people say, oh nga no, hindi ko naisip yun ah. Oh nga no. Hindi lang siya, palagi kasi naka-focus siya na to fix people as if that's the problem, to eliminate drugs, when in fact it's broader than that. And we have to think of the responses as for the society, for the community, rather than just fixing individuals. So nabobroaden. So that, for example, pag sinabi mo na, when people talk about problems, then I realize, hey, it's not automatic. Kasi drugs, therefore problems. No, there are other things going on in their lives. And data and evidence tell us that, right? Where most of the people using drugs really do so in an unproblematic manner and are engaging, are employed, being responsible parents, just living their lives, essentially not harming anyone. So, yeah, that's such a long answer to your one question. Sorry,
You
my
talk
mind
about
just kind of goes.
no, that's all right. You talk about the work itself evolving over time. What do you think of as the heart of your advocacy? How do you describe that?
When I think about it, the two words that come up, three pala kasi two words yung isa, but it's respect and human connection, right? And that's something that we all want, right? And the respect and human connection means seeing people as whole beings. Okay. And what NoBox is wanting to share is that it's no different when it comes to people using drugs and people whose lives include drugs. And I think having that understanding and kind of pushing that is very, very important, because when we forget that and we just look at drugs, person using drugs. We box them into one thing. We've reduced people into one thing. That's where the problem happens, right? We alienate, we marginalize. We see them as problems, and when we see problems, we just think of eliminating problems. And that just kind of screws up everything. But when we realize that people are whole beings, people whose lives include drugs included, then we also realize that they are moving around in systems and contexts, right? Which shape how their lives are. What surrounds us shapes us, right? So we cannot talk about drugs or people using drugs without the context in which it is happening. So yun siguro is kind of at the heart of it, with the North Star of the rights and well-being of people who use or whose lives include drugs, who are part of our communities and our society. It's really then also getting that awareness, understanding that we need to zoom out so that we can fix the structures in place, right? Not only to address but to prevent the problems that we tend to attribute to drugs, which may be actually brought by systems. So what's an example there, di ba? For example, in providing help, people tend to say na kailangan pilitin kasi hindi yan pupunta. Di ba? And that led to policies that had people being listed on drug watch lists, being forced to be in programs, being punished if they don't or if they don't finish, di ba? Maybe it's about asking ourselves, how do we create, what would it take for us to have safe, welcoming spaces where people who may need help, may want to reach out, would be able to do so in a way where they don't feel scared, they know they won't be humiliated, they know that their dignity will be intact. And we have seen this again and again and again. When you create those spaces, people connect. But we don't give the chance. So it's shifting. And so that's a lot of the work, I think. It's shifting how we understand things because right now, the way the narrative is, sobrang limited. And then we get frustrated because the only marker is about use or non-use di ba? Kasi meron, for example, we've had, for example, local government officials frustrated kasi binigay na daw lahat. Hindi pa rin nag-a-attend, hindi pa rin nag-ano. But binigay ba natin? We never asked the people involved what it is they need and what would be helpful and what would be doable. So ganon. That shifting, I think that's the
So I want to be careful because
okay.
it sounds like there's a lot of layers here that we need to
Yes.
peel, right? What I'm hearing is a big part of your mission is restoring the respect and dignity of people who are addicted to drugs. And one of the ways we can do that is by, I guess, broadening our mental narratives. I guess this question I want to ask Inez is coming from because we live in the Philippines where we spent the last few years na the predominant narrative is war on drugs. But I wanna start first with the fundamentals. Why is it important to challenge this idea or this narrative about drug addicts in the first place?
Because it limits our understanding, and when it limits our understanding, we then limit the way we can respond. That's one. Number two, even the term addict can be very, very subjective, right? And it's even a term that's not encouraged to be used. When we don't get an understanding of that bigger picture, understanding what people go through, what kind of support they need, then hindi natin matutugunan, right? And we end up only thinking that it's the person. Ano din yan, mental mind, ano din yan, mindset din yan, no? Mental model na individualism. So therefore, it's easy to blame. It's the easiest track, di ba? Sila yung sasabihan na there's something wrong with them. We punish them, we eliminate them, instead of figuring out where is the problem really, what really is the problem, and where is it coming from. Ang problema doon, we deprive ourselves as a society of having the necessary responses, programs, policies that will really be, I said, supportive and uplift Filipino society. But then it's also unfair, even to families, for example. Kasi they will think immediately the blame would go to a loved one, di ba? The other thing also is, siguro even in having conversations and discussions around this, that's a term that we might want to set aside for the moment. And maybe we're really talking about people using drugs, for example, right? And when we talk about people using drugs, we're really looking about a human experience, which is a range of realities. Diba? Hindi siya pare-pareho for everyone. Just think of how, for example, something that is legal, alcohol, right? We might all, both of us can be taking alcohol, somebody else outside, but their circumstances are different. Is it celebrating? Is it because depressed? Are they angry? And this tend to shape also the behavior that happens, diba? So kailangan siya intindihin.
What I'm hearing, Ines, is we need to challenge and question our assumptions about what does it mean to use drugs. Do we even use the term addiction to drugs?
Yeah.
How do we think of the people who use them? Because our mindset shapes the solutions or interventions that we come up with.
Yes. Yes.
I'm also hearing that it impacts not just how we treat the people who we see using drugs, but it also affects their immediate families, their loved ones, how we behave, how they behave. For people who don't have any direct interactions, though, like I don't use it, I don't know anyone who uses it. Why is this a conversation that's worth having? Why is it important for us to also have dialogues, discussions, to know better, to interrogate our assumptions, to reshape our narratives? Why is that important?
Speaking of layers, that's a lot. In that so I was trying to write notes and sabi ko, ang dami. Why? So isa na I mentioned no, na it limits how we respond and respond in ways that actually help, that actually support, and which respect and value human dignity. So I think another would be it's unfair, right? So I remember one who was attending our group discussions, no, and her partner, her husband was somebody who was using drugs, and because of the narrative and how government policy actions were, it causes a rift, which made her think now that there's really something wrong with my partner, my husband. So they would fight and everything, but through a more broadened discussion, also where they're able to share their experiences, how they think, questions they ask, we ask, and through that, one thing that was striking was when she said, "Oh, mas naintindihan ko ngayon." And she actually talked about how the relationship became better. Right? Because there was more
Correct.
communications. So even a simple, yung hindi siya visible, di ba, necessarily, na napag-uusapan. Ganon, unfair. So, unfair din siya because the focus is on elimination, right? Kaya nga yung quote-unquote, that phrase which I don't like to repeat because it legitimizes it. It shouldn't. But the elimination of the substances. And sunod doon is the elimination of the people associated with the substances and affiliated, which we already have seen how people have been killed and murdered essentially right? Because they did not meet the conditions that society put for them. But it can also be unfair where, for example, in schools, if we have that focus on elimination, then that's how people justify the use of drug testing. Even when, number one, it's not helpful. It's a snapshot, doesn't tell you who the person is, what's going on in their lives. And it identifies, stigmatizes, punishes, right? And you have schools who would expel the students. You would have students who would then be subjected to teasing, right? From friends. Uh, I know one instance where, sure, that the young person wasn't officially expelled, but the parents were told, better take out your child because we don't want them here. You take out a child, a student in the middle of a school year. So you're looking at the personal level, di ba? Ano kaya iniisip? What is a child going through? And medyo feeling depressed na, di ba? And then, what do you do? Hindi naman pwedeng pumasok sa school, in another school, mid-year. Alam mo yung layers of complications that we are causing because of the policies and the thinking we have around drugs. So instances like that, in responding and thinking of policies and programs, we always need to self-check and step back. Is this really helpful and supporting? And according to whom? Minsan kasi it's according to the ones crafting the policies. Eh. People who experience it, hindi man lang kinakausap, pinapakinggan. And then we need to ask ourselves, at what cost and at whose expense, di ba? A solution, a response, a policy, a program that aggravates, exacerbates situations is not a solution. Di ba? Hindi dahil well-intentioned siya, okay na yon. Maraming well-intentioned in the space of drug responses that have caused more harm than good.
I like one of the things that you said, Ines, where you don't want to repeat certain narratives because it legitimizes them.
Yeah.
Why don't you help us paint a different picture in our heads? I know that you said that your knowledge is still evolving as you continue to have dialogue with experts, with people who are on the ground, with those who are using or have experience with drugs. But give us a lens through which we can look at and understand drug use and people who use them.
Siguro one of the things that you were mentioning kanina na, you know, not knowing people who are using, right? How do we know? Really? I'm not questioning what you said, but generally I would hear that, right? But because people don't talk openly about their drug use, right? Um, And then another striking thing is how we were also having a conversation with community partners. So when I say community partners, these are essentially persons whose lives include drugs, who use drugs, who participate in drug trade systems, for example. And I forgot lang the exact question she asked, but parang tinanong niya, parang anong tingin niyo sa amin? Right? So meaning the moment we find out that people are using drugs or nagsishift ba, we need to notice that shift in us no? And if we notice that shift, what made the difference, diba? Kunyari, we're talking, right? And I am having this dominant narrative in my head. And then suddenly you tell me a story that, like last weekend, I'm using some, whatever it is, right? Nag-iba ba tingin? But you're still the same person I'm talking to, right? The stories we shared, the discussion doesn't change. So yun. So I think the first is really connecting with people as people. If siguro you can connect with people and really get to know them, be curious about their lives, what makes them laugh, what makes them cry, what is life like. We are in There are discussions around policy reform going on, even with government, right? However reform whatever reform means in their minds. But the one thing we would always say is connect with the people who use drugs, go to the communities, get to know them, get to know the lives. Not because you're trying to solve a problem. You know what I mean? You don't start with saying problema sila, intindihin ko to. But start with just getting to know them, just having a better understanding. Then you will be able to eventually pinpoint na, ito pala yung problema. Uh, Sorry, that probably sounds so vague, no? Pero,
No, but it's also very. I think it's very vague. But what I'm hearing is that we need to check ourselves first.
oo,
We have to check our own assumptions as people first. How do we view the people around us, and how do we view people who might be using drugs? I like that you are resistant to the use of labels. Even the word drug addict, parang we should question that. And it goes back to connecting with them as people first and foremost, and calling for compassion and open-mindedness and understanding.
yeah, yeah.
But in hearing you say things, Ines, as well about how some of these narratives kasi are deeply embedded, it also points to how it's not really just a me problem or a them problem.
Yeah.
It is a
Us.
systemic
It is us.
problem, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
It involves how we're raised by our parents, how we're educated in
Mm-hmm,
school,
mm-hmm.
how laws shape our perception, and our approach to these people. And so I see now how broad and how big and how deep these challenges are that you're working on at the foundation. Um, but also at the same time, how simple I think, or at least how simple
Yes.
it sounds. Like, what do we need to do? We just need to remember their people. We just need to come in without prejudgment. And we need to look at it not just as they're the problem, but how are we all maybe contributing to the challenges, and therefore how can we move forward together?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Yes, the assumptions we have, and the thing with assumptions, kasi particularly when it comes to drugs and persons whose lives include drugs, the assumptions we don't even realize are assumptions, but we just take them as this is the world, this is how it works, this is how it is, right? So it is through the conversations and openness, I think that we can realize na oo nga, no? I was just assuming na ganun siya. And when I say that, it can be so invisible, meaning it can happen in research. And we have seen this, right? So the mindset coming in sa research will shape the kind of data you're going to pull out and how you're going to analyze that data, how you're going to frame your report. We saw this. So, for example, there was this one particular research they did, and the explanation of the researcher was how there were some people who went to quote unquote treatment, and he said some in the group claimed they did not need treatment. I said, wait a minute. You just phrased those two things differently. You took this as a fact. You took the other one as they claimed. Meaning, sabi nila yon, but may not have sabi. So I asked her to talk more about this. And she talked about how, well, they haven't, this is difficult because I don't want to repeat ideology statements. But essentially, she was saying that people were, quote unquote, in denial. They didn't see they needed treatment. I said, wait a minute. why are you now putting in your assumptions and biases into the data? Because actually, if you look at it, there are people using drugs who do not need any kind of treatment or intervention or anything, right? And the data bears that out. So yun. Meron isang discussions, and this is within the context of human rights discussions, no? Parang, what compels them to use drugs? Compel? Parang tinanong mo rin what compels you to drink coffee. Alam mo yon, may assumption. So doon pa lang, ang lalim na ng assumption. So you're right. If we're able to pause, have conversations, and maybe, and listen. Okay, when you say have conversation, I think it's a lot of listening. And I think this is what has really been helpful as well. When you come in also with a mindset that you don't have all the information and the knowledge, and it's really about getting to know each other and learning from each other when we come together with that. Ang laking tulong yan.
You mentioned earlier that even just in listening, you yourself discovered perspectives you hadn't considered before. Can you share with me an example of those discoveries that you've had that came from
Oo.
listening?
Like isa, I kind of referred to it na kanina, di ba? So, for example, now there's a lot of conversations about needing substances like shabu to work longer hours, right? And that's
Yeah.
actually even in the advocacy, right? But then wait a minute, maybe the question is, how comes stable access to stable employment where people do not need to work super long hours? Di ba tayo, we have limits like well-being and so on and so forth. Teka muna, bakit ganon? Di ba? Baka yun yung kailangan tanungin. And so now you're looking at the system and the context rather than just identifying individuals, right? And then what happens is when people are using drugs, participating in drug trade systems, these are the social realities, and these are and people are living in communities where informal economy is the norm, and this is just one of them, right? With us, with work, it's whatever is accessible to us, what's doable, what we can do. It's the same thing, right? Drugs, participation in drug trade systems happen to be one of them, right? What I'm asking is, let's try to understand what this looks like, diba? If you have limited access to opportunities, and that is the only one that's going to put food on the table, you're going to take that. And what this was telling us actually is that people using drugs in this certain situations or participating in drug trade systems, it is not about that actual behavior or participating in drug trade systems, but it is about our inherent value of doing anything and everything for our children, right? If there's no food and this will put food on the table and there are no other options, this is it. Siguro yun din when we talk about options and choices. Sometimes discourse is mukhang may assumption siya na everybody has access to the same options and choices. Hindi ganun eh, di ba? Hindi natin alam eh. Iba yung support system, iba yung dynamics in the community, and so on and so forth. So, yun. So siguro that was very, very deep. Understanding that. Or how somebody actually shared na she was participating in drug trade system, selling once in a while. It's not a stable job, right? It's not their whole life. But what was striking when she said, okay na ako, tapos na ako. Napag-graduate ko na sila lahat. Professionals na lahat. Can you imagine that? And that's not an isolated case. We've heard that multiple times. And then what was even interesting, when later on she was making kwento how one of her daughters, graduate na, di ba? Nag-apply for work. Ngayon, may requirements, di ba? Medical, check-up, ang dami requirements, which need money, which they don't have. So what happened? Sabi niya, I had to sell a few so she would have money to fulfill her requirements so she can have a job in the legal formal economy. Can you imagine that? Bakit ganon? Diba? So those are the questions I think that we need to ask ourselves. And kailangan din yan in discourses around reform. We do have the space now, and I think in the current administration, diba? There are conversations around it. But if the mindset and systems remain the same about fixing persons, limited yon. Baka pa nga harmful eh. Di ba sabi ko nga kanina, kung yung mindset is the binary thinking of, oh, we're not naman killing them eh. We're putting them in rehab. Eh kung hindi kailangan, what if the rehab in itself is a detention facility because we force them there for a period of time where it's about discipline and punishment? Hindi rin helpful. Di ba? So, ang daming kailangan gawin talaga, Albert. You're right. It's layers, it's the nuance, and it goes back to the mindset and our thinking around it, and the values that drive us, actually. So, yeah.
Why do you think the stigma continues to persist? What's fueling that?
Well, one is something that I've mentioned also. It's how we've been taught and raised to think about drugs and people using drugs, diba? So that even in situations and spaces where help is supposed to be provided, nagiging harmful yung quote-unquote help. Diba? Which I've already shared, diba? The drug testing, putting people on lists, forcing them into programs they don't need or not relevant to their lives. And then the law, which now reinforces this thinking or a reflection of this thinking, where if you read our drug law, it's just about punishing, 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 and the assumption that drugs is the concern when in fact it's not, right? For example, there's something in the drug law that talks about if a person who is in a rehab detention, I really call it detention, a rehab detention facility, would quote unquote escape, would leave, and then government and rehab claims voluntary to. Hindi siya voluntary. If the person wanted to leave, there's something wrong somewhere. And yet our law will punish the person and say, in 1 week, you had better go back. The family better find ways for that person to go back, or there's going to be sanctions and penalties. When in fact, shouldn't the question be, wait a minute, what happened? What was it in that rehab detention facility, in the way, in the manner things were being done, that may require some looking into, right? How can we listen to the experiences of the persons who go through these, and try to figure out how to make it better and truly helpful, right? But even that is difficult kasi I have actually heard of reports where there were complaints, for example, that were filed. And when this particular agency checked on it, these violations were actually happening, the abuses were happening. But they actually said, ay, baka part yan ng program to punish them. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. You are an agency, for example, that is about human rights. And you will now justify violation is a violation of human rights, right? And you're gonna justify it that way. So, na kasi baka programa siya, kasi baka disiplina and punishment. Saan ka nakakita when it comes to health and support na may punishment involved? Wala naman, di ba? Parang ganon. So it's that. It's the way we think about it, the law that reflects this thinking and reinforces it. Wow, ang dami. What fuels the stigma? Kasi you have the way stories are being reported, right? Where it reinforces the idea na drugs, therefore, problem. And they don't make kwento about the different factors that were happening that led to that situation. It doesn't tell you what was lacking in terms of, for example, access to services, mental health services, access to support. Wala yun sa kwento, di ba? So siguro it's trying to, when we make kwento, whether it's in just like an interaction, a conversation, and maybe how media writes, it would be helpful to step back and try to get a more complete story. Ang palaging hindi natatanong would be people whose lives include drugs. Pag tinatanong man sila ng media, it seems it's like dinidiin, di ba? Ginawa mo ba talaga to? Ito yan. Hindi ganyan, di ba? It's really to understand it sana. Malaking bagay yon kasi um, as long as we don't recognize that people whose lives include drugs, and especially those really impacted by the policies we have, if we do not seek them and value their experiences and insights, our policies and programs will always be disconnected from the realities and most likely will always cause harm rather than support and help. Yun yung kulang. Ang daming meetings we've attended, well-meaning, pero sabi mo palagi, teka muna, may kulang dito. Why aren't we inviting people whose lives include drugs? Why aren't people here who are living these realities, living the realities of how our policies are? Because that's how we will improve. Balik tayo sa mindset. Kasi the thinking is, we, society, experts in our offices are the experts. And sila beneficiaries lang or, alam mo yun, parang passive recipients of whatever we dish out. Dapat the other way around yan. Ito muna intindihin natin, ano ba yung difficulties? Ano ba yung also strengths? And I like this one quote from a colleague when he said na parang there are no hard to reach drug users, it's just hard to reach services. So shifting yun, di ba? What would it take to make the services we provide relevant, useful, accessible? Yun yung mga tanong natin, kailangan. Di ba? Let's kind of look at how we can improve the system and the policies, right? Instead of just targeting individuals and trying to fix them. Let's fix the system.
I think one of the costs as well, if we continue to persist in our current thinking, is that we'll continue to keep on addressing the symptom rather than the root of the problem itself. In the spirit of helping us reshape our mindsets and cultural narratives, what would a more humane and compassionate approach to drugs look like? I know you mentioned earlier that it starts with seeing them as people and extending them respect, compassion. Are there other, I guess, operating principles that you would recommend?
Seeing them as people, that human connection, kailangan yun. And the fact that, again, as I mentioned, people whose lives include drugs have to be at critical decision-making tables. Kasi otherwise, even talking about humane may not actually be humane because humane is defined according to how we think it is. For example, in discussions around reform now, there's a binary thinking about killing, arresting, treatment, as if these are just two separate things, where reform and humane is thought to be the treatment, when in fact are not necessarily so. So critical yon, na in every discussion, we need to have people with the living the experiences. When we have that, then we have a better understanding of the context and the struggles and the barriers and also what is helpful. Then maybe we would now be able to talk about and invest in what would it take to build supportive communities, right? People whose lives include drugs have been reduced to that one detail in their lives, when in fact hindi siya necessarily so. And those have implications na on the programs and policies we have in place.
Are there examples, whether from NoBox's work or elsewhere, that show us that change is possible?
Mm, Yeah. And maybe when we say change, I have to ask, like, what changes do you have in mind in asking that question? Because people have assumptions about what needs to be changed. And who needs changing and what needs changing, right? Because if we talk about change, then it is possible. It is possible for actually people to change how they think about people who use drugs. Whether it's a family member who realizes, for example, that a family member who they find out is using drugs again and maybe having problems, realize it's not the drugs and there are other ways to support instead of the usual response of throwing them into a rehab detention facility, right? We have seen community members who now see in a more broadened idea of how it is and then changes even the way they see themselves as passive recipients of aid or any help into saying, hey, we have something to contribute. And people have seen us one way, but no, we reclaim our narrative. This is how we are. We contribute to the community. We were part of the technical working group for drugs in the UN Joint Program for Human Rights, where there was a pilot where you have now local government who realize that you don't channel people through boxes of predetermined programs, but really opening up the options to the different services and how it doesn't follow a sequence. There's no automatic assumption that you have to go through these 15 modules of talking about drugs or whatever that has no immediate connection to your life, right? So those are the changes that happened. Changes that realize that there are these interconnected realities that we have to deal with when it comes to laws. So you're not just talking drug law, you're talking about all the different, you're talking about the mental health law, you're talking about HIV, you're talking about universal healthcare, you're talking about these things. So that I think that, so those are the changes.
For someone who might be who wants to also help change the narrative, what are some
It would start off siguro with understanding that things are not always dictate everything that, or I don't know, siguro starting from that. Reading a news report. Di ba ang dami nun? Where the, and then lalagyan nila na some statement around yun. So that's one. So things are not always what they seem. So always question what you're reading, what you're hearing, what you're seeing. And then siguro in questioning, sige, drugs is part of the picture. Set aside natin. May iba pa kaya nangyayari? Just being curious. Yun, siguro. That's one. Just be curious. Siguro third is really getting to know people who use drugs, or I would say who use drugs pala. And then the continuous engagement with community partners, people use drugs, this openness then allows you to see the complexities, which are not necessarily complicated, but because as a human experience is complex. Tapos, so yun, makikita mo, ma-appreciate mo na, ay, may ibang bagay pa pala. Ay, hindi pala automatic na ganito lang kasi nasabi natin, di ba? Um, Siguro yun. I mean, ang daming pwedeng gawin, pwedeng tanungin. Siguro that would be a starting point. And siguro if somebody in the family or somebody we know using drugs, and sometimes we just thinking of solutions, anong gagawin sa kanila, maybe it's about connecting. I remember this one story when we're having these conversations with one friend. Eventually, sabi niya, oh nga, no? Sabi niya, alam mo, so what changed? Like, there was this neighbor who they knew was using drugs who would come in, sit down, or nandyan lang, di ba? So people are thinking, anong dapat gawin, saan dadali, etc. And then one day, she just realized she just wanted to say, how are you? Wow, that in itself is so powerful. Because nobody ever asks people who use drugs or seen as problems as that, and you realize the complexities and the beauty. And I think that's the one thing that I realized then, now we're missing out on so much as a society because we've chosen to put people in boxes and label them and set them aside and set conditions before we would connect with them as humans, as human beings. In fact, kind of gotten to a point where if I'm talking with someone and I forget pala na the person's using drugs because you see the entirety, di ba? You see the beauty, the amazing. And I think if we get to this, it's also being prepared to be amazed because we've been missing out on so much. I've learned so much from persons who have openly talked about using drugs and even participation in drug trade systems. But also be ready because I've also seen shifts in people we've engaged with who started with a more dominant narrative to a more nuanced one and feeling that frustration. I was like, well, welcome to the advocacy. That's when you feel it. So yun. Long answer again, no? But yun, just continually please ask questions, get to know, be curious, and know that things are not always the same and there's always a story behind the story behind the story. Yeah.
As we come to a close, Inez, how can people support the work that NoBox Foundation is doing?
So we do have social media accounts on Facebook, NoBox Transitions, Twitter, and so on. How can they help? There are one is to open up spaces, create spaces. For example, to have these open, honest conversations and also have people ask questions. And I think when people ask questions and having a space for that, we all learn together. Yeah. And siguro, ask the critical questions. And there would, kasi of the intersectionality, marami talaga. Like, I could make a whole list maybe. But for example, you have people who are really good in terms of policies or crafting or doing research and so on and so forth. So I think coming together and exploring possibilities would be one. Kasi yung no box also what we offer is only useful and meaningful when it's in the context of collaborative work. Diba? Hindi siya one way. It's about an exchange.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Inez. Appreciate the conversation. Salamat, salamat. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for creating this space for this conversation. It's super appreciated. Thank you so much, Albert.
That's it for this episode of Drawing on Hope. A big thank you to Inez for sharing their story and vision for a better tomorrow. If you found today's conversation meaningful, share it with someone who could use a little hope and inspiration. And if you want to hear more stories of changemakers working to build a better tomorrow, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps others find the show. Drawing on Hope is a podcast by Pushpin, a social impact design agency that uses drawings and stories to help make things make sense. Follow us at Pushpin Visuals on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, or visit www.pushpinvisuals.com. As always, keep drawing on hope, keep building a better world, and we'll see you next time.